ever heard of a contract test? Has anybody ever written one? Even better. Cool. I can just make things up. This is going to be great. Okay. So we already went around the room, talked about ourselves. Ooh, I should give a blog mention though. I'm doing a new thing this year. Instead of a New Year's resolution, I'm doing a new resolution every month. In February, I'm going to try to write a blog entry every week. So if you follow blogs, mine's at jdlubrano.github.com. There's not much there now, but I do plan to add to it. That's my personal plug. That's why I showed up. Okay, so tests. I think one of, if not the steepest learning curve for any new developer to learn when they become a professional is testing. It's never covered in school. I've never been to a boot camp. Maybe it is covered in boot camps and things like that, but testing's really an area of software that in and of itself isn't terribly polished. Like some of your hackiest code you'll ever write will be setting up your test cases and getting them to run. So I'm going to go ahead and add another type of test to go with the integration test, the unit test, the performance test, the end-to-end test, the feature test, the system test, security test that we already have. And that's a contract test. So what the heck are these? First of all, let's take a step back and let's ask ourselves, what is a contract? So a contract is a two-way agreement. It's a binding agreement, and there are usually penalties when one of the two parties violates that agreement. That's a really good contract there. So a contract test, it's sort of like an integration test. It's at least a higher level test than something like a unit test. And it's really when two applications, usually a client, a consumer, and a provider of some sort, the application that it talks to, agree to work together. Contract tests provide the binding part of the contract, and those are your test cases, and the penalties when you breach that contract, which would be failures in your test. Big red circle on Circle CI. So the nice thing about contract tests compared to like all the other literature and types of tests that are out there is they really only work well in a narrow use case, although an important use case. When you have the best example is an API, but it really could be any application from a high level. We call that the provider. And some client, it could be a library that you write. It could just be another application that talks to your provider. And we call that the consumer. So you have a provider and a consumer. When you control both of those things, a contract test is really the best way, in my opinion, to make sure that those two systems continue to work together. So that changes in one system don't break the other system. Another couple high-level things is like the consumers in contract testing, the powerful thing you can do is your consumers can drive the features of your provider. So your API really only exists to serve this certain set of clients that you have, right? And your consumers, your clients, can then tell you when you need to add data or prevent you from modifying data structures. We'll get into how that works a little bit later. And you also want the number of consumers to be manageable. So a really bad case for a contract test would be a public API, like a Google Maps API. They wouldn't want contract tests because they have millions of consumers out there, and who wants to maintain all of those contracts? Like the Google API exists because they provide maps to the world, right? So they're just going to provide what they're going to provide. They don't really care about your little web app that geocodes things. They're Google. And then why are they useful? So the following scenarios are usually really manual or really difficult without contract tests. So consider like you're writing your API and you want to deprecate an endpoint. What do? You look through all of the source code of all of your libraries that use it. You look through all the source code of all of the other applications that use it. You send emails to the people who wrote the applications that use it and say, hey, do you actually use this thing? And they say, I don't know.
Wait here and then
that's valid.
Running in the console for a year first, and then everyone ignores it.
So that's all kind of like horribly manual when you want to deprecate something. It'd be really great if you were a provider, if you were writing your API and you had test cases. I was like, if I remove this, does it break anybody using my stuff? That would be really nice. Contract tests will let us do that. If you're a client and you want more data from an API, how do you usually communicate that? You send an email to somebody, or you have a meeting and you talk about you draw the JSON structure on a whiteboard and you add the field right there. It'd be a lot better to have some code-driven thing that you could hand to your API developers, and you could say, hey, can you make this test green? If you make this test green, we're good. And then furthermore, like if you want to modify a data structure in your API, even like you change a data type, or something becomes nullable, or you want to remove a field, you want to move a field and turn something that was like a belong or a has one to a has many. Contract tests could even help you there. If they don't help you make that change, they'll at least tell you what you're breaking when you make it, so you can do the proper communication and tell them to upgrade their gems or version your API. You can take the proper steps to make sure you're not causing pain to the other applications. Okay, so contract tests. In the words of John David, how do? The good news is there's a really great framework. It's called the Pact framework. You can look at the documentation, docs.pact.io. They have libraries, gems, whatever, for Ruby, C#, Swift, JavaScript. I mean, they've got a ton of support for a ton of different languages, so it's really awesome. And it's like if you have a Ruby provider and a JavaScript consumer, that's fine. Pact communicates between providers and consumers using JSON, so it's completely language like independent that way, which is awesome. So, as an example, I wrote a dumb provider, which is my quote of the day API, which we'll go through some code examples here momentarily. And I have a consumer, the quote of the day client, which is a Ruby gem. And we're going to write some contract tests for these guys. Well, I'm going to show you some because live coding is not really my jam. So there is a little bit of boilerplate that comes along with the Pact gem. Thank you. And you add a gem to the gem file, and then in your provider you would have something that looks like this. You wouldn't need all this with Rails. This is actually my provider's a Sinatra app, so some things are pretty explicit. But you can see that you have this Pact kind of configuration block. You say that I am a Pact service provider. I call myself the quote of the day service, and I'm going to honor a Pact with my client gem. And I have a Pact URI. So this is local because it was easier for me to develop that way, but that could be an S3 URL. They have another gem called Pact Broker, which I haven't played with, but it's like some cloud-based solution to just hit an endpoint to always get an up-to-date JSON file with your contract tests. But yeah, I mean, if I was going to do it here at MakeTime, I'd probably just do an S3 URL and see how far that takes us. I think it would be all right. But this is an important part about Pact, is like your consumers are going to have tests that lay out the contract for your provider. And the output of running those tests is just a JSON file that, in this case, Pact knows how to read and interpret, and it's going to generate test cases for your provider. So the JSON is going to be produced by your consumer, and the provider is going to read that JSON in, run those test cases against itself, and tell you if it upholds its end of the bargain. Does that make sense? I hope I explained that well enough. Okay, and then more boilerplate in the consumer. Since it's a gem, we add the Pact gem to our gem spec. And then on the consumer side, you declare yourself a Pact service consumer, call yourself the client gem. You say that you have a Pact with the quote of the day service. And in order to run these tests, Pact is going to stand up like a mock service on some port so that your client can generate JSON. You'll see with the test cases, like this is just something Pact needs. It's really not important what the port is or how you set this up. It's honestly just boilerplate. Okay, so our first endpoint in our provider is just get at /quote, and it's going to give you today's quote of the day. So we go and we get a quote, and we render JSON with a quote and some content. Pretty simple. How would we write a contract test for this? I don't want to do that yet. Well, maybe I do. Sure. The consumer, this is just kind of what the code would look like to consume that, is we're going to make a GET request to /quote, and we're going to return some quote object. Okay? So pretty simple implementation, pretty dumb. The most important part is actually our contract test here. So I decided to save these in spec/pact. You can save it wherever you want, I think. But Pact does have, with our spec, it does have Pact test type up here. But here we're just setting up our quote of the day client. We're going to give it a base URI at localhost 1234. So that's, if you remember back to the mock service, we set it up to run locally on port 1234. So that's really the only place this is important when we set up our client to work with our Pact mock service. And then this is the really interesting part. This is where we define sort of our contract. We say that our quote of the day service, upon receiving a request for quote, just some descriptive text for our contract, with a GET at /quote, you're going to respond with an OK response, application JSON headers, and you're going to give me back a quote, and you're going to give me back some content. This Pact-like helper is basically saying content is a string. It's going to be like quote this, but a string. Okay? And then in our test case, we run that, and the weird part about these tests is I don't want to dive too far and make my contract test unit tests in my consumers. So I usually just do something like really dumb and really high level. I shouldn't say dumb, but just very basic for the test case. So like run client.getQuote and check that the content equals the content. That might even be a step too far. This is really the important part though, where you're setting up your expectations of the service. When the service receives a GET request at /quote, it's going to give you back a body with quote and content. All right. So you can actually run that in your provider then. After you run that test in your client, you get your JSON file, and then in your provider, you can run this reg test, pact verify, and this first block, we'll write these other tests later, but this first block says upon receiving a request for quote with a GET at /quote, do I return a response with a 200 with a body like that and headers of application JSON. I do all three of those things. My provider upholds its contract. And right now I have confidence that if I ran the client get quote, it's going to work. The provider is going to give me back the data structure I expect. We can do the same thing, similar thing, for creating quotes. This gets a little more interesting because now we have an error case to consider. If the quote's valid, we'll save it and we'll return it as JSON. If it's invalid, we'll give back a useful error. Okay? The consumer, without getting too much in the weeds, it's going to send a post to /quote with this body, so a quote with content, and it's going to try to create a quote. In the event that it fails, we're going to raise some useful error. Is everybody cool with that? Was that too fast? Too furious? Okay, so this test, happy path, when the quote content is valid. Quote of the day service, given, so this is an important distinction. We had two states. We had a provider and our provider, right? The quote can be saved or the quote content's valid. The quote can't be saved. The quote content is invalid. However you want to do that. But this is defining what Pact calls a provider state. And I'll go into exactly how you set that up in your provider in a minute. but this is sort of our happy path branch of our code. So given that whatever we send our provider is a valid quote, when it receives a request to create a quote, a post at /quote with a body and the content of the quote, it's going to give me back a 201 and the quote with an ID. So I run one test case where I call create quote and I check a couple things. And that's the bad case. If I ran packed verify, I would see, given that the quote content's valid, a request to create a quote, post quote, gives back 201, gives back the body I expect, and it gives back the headers I expect. So I'm good. My happy path on the provider is good. If I send a valid quote, it's going to save it and it's going to render it back to me. Seems simple enough. And now, the failure case, a little more interesting. Quote of the day service, when the quote content's invalid, it's going to render back a 422 with a useful error message and type. Okay, and then my client gem is going to raise a quote of the day error. That's not nearly as interesting as the result here. Given that the quote content's invalid, it's going to render back a 422. It's going to render back an error with type and a message, and it's still going to give me back my headers. So I have 3 interactions here that are all defined, happy path, sad path. Everything's laid out as a contract between the client and the provider. And as long as these tests stay green, we're good. If I wanted to add a field, if my client gem needed to add a field, I could write a contract test where I change this body, where I change this body to have another field, and I could say, hey, there's a new test case. Could you make it turn green? Maybe it needs created at and updated at or something like that. I could add it to this test case. If the provider wants to just add created at or updated at, that test case will still pass. Anything extra will still make it pass. You can add whatever you want. Similar for any of the other cases we described. I talked a little bit about the provider state, so I'm just show you guys kind of how to set that up, because these two things are decoupled right now. Like when these tests run, all I have is a mock service. I'm not actually running like this string, given the quote content is invalid and given the quote content is valid, really doesn't mean much besides some string I just used to describe the state of the world. So what you do have to do in your provider is set up those states. The nice thing is, if you have, and I should have output of this, but I don't. Bad presenter. If I ran my contract test the first time, PAC's going to yell at me and say, hey, your contract tests have a couple states and you haven't defined those. It has a state for the quote content is valid and a state for the quote content is invalid. You need to define those before I can run your PAC tests. So that's pretty good. That's about as good as you can get as far as support from like these two decoupled systems that actually are coupled, but you don't want them to run that way. So our first provider state, the quote content is valid. That's just a no-op. Like I don't have validations or anything. If you did, you could stub out things and make sure that the quote would be saved. You could even stub out like quote save if you wanted, but I'm not a big fan of stubbing save. And then here in the quote content is invalid, I'm willing to stub the failure case. I'm just going to say any quote, no matter what the data came in as, it's going to like be invalid. That's all. Just high level. That's how I force a failure. So that's pretty much all I have. Does anybody have any questions? I want to open it up for questions though.
So that last slide, that runs like before all the contract tests run? That's something that you're...
Yes. So when you run rake packed verify, this file will run and kind of load up like the states. So let me show the JSON for the packed file. I can do that.
But a reg task you're mentioning, is that something you're running for the provider to verify that the
Yes.
provider meets the spec?
Yes. Actually, yeah, let me do this. So maybe that one. Or not.
Or is there a response?
I'll just go show it then. You know, I've got it. It'll be fine. So this is what that JSON actually looks like, Michael, and you can see that this is kind of our contract for one of those provider states. So that rake task, let me go run it real quick. So this is in the so that rake task is going to go pull this JSON file. It's going to go read the provider states in there, and then it's going to go read its provider states and make sure you have them all. Probably does that in the reverse order. Like it probably reads all through your provider states and like sets up some hash of the state of the world and says, I have these provider states. Let me go parse this JSON and look for all of those provider states and let me make sure I have them all. If I didn't, let's just look at that error. I don't really remember what it looks like. This is a risk. This whole thing can come crashing down. So if I comment that state out and run this, it's actually going to tell me, hey, there's a provider state in that JSON and you haven't set it up. You need to set that up. So that's pretty nice. Let me see what I can do.
So what are these blocks actually setting up for?
They're setting up so that when, let me pull that up side by side. Nope. Spec packs thing. Open. So the quote content is valid is setting up for this test case, meaning you're going to receive a quote or a post @ quote, and you're going to spit back, or it's going to have this body, and you're going to spit back this content. Maybe better, the failure case. This is the invalid case. You're going to set up this state of the world before you run this test.
Oh, so it's actually running those requests through your actual server.
That's right.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
Yeah, so when your consumer runs, it's running against a mock service and you're just telling the mock what to do. When your provider runs, it's going to stand itself up and hit these endpoints given the states you set up here, and make sure that your API, your endpoint from an integration level is going to spit back these expectations.
So if you had two consumers, each one of them would write their own contract test?
That's exactly right.
Maybe
So
in the contract?
when I talked earlier about like, can I deprecate this endpoint? So if you have really good folks writing your consumers, if they don't use an endpoint, they wouldn't write a contract test for that. So if you have an endpoint lying around you, I don't think anybody actually uses this. You could remove it, and you could run all your contract tests. Be like, yep, none of my consumers even use it. Let's just get rid of it. That's really nice.
So it's kind of up to the consumer to keep track of what they're doing and to write out what tests they need to write out.
Yes, and that's why it's really important to, like, as a kind of a prerequisite for contract testing, whether they're a good fit is somehow, whether it's your own company or even your own team or yourself, you control to some degree the development of your consumers and your providers, that you can all agree to contract testing as a means of like your things working together.
Is the workflow like
You could do it that way, but honestly, you could run this against every PR that you have. Like you could run this as a part of your integration suite. I mean, if all of your packs, all of those JSON files are in the cloud somewhere, you could define them in. Let me find it. No. Spec packs. Nope. Service consumers. Yeah, you could line them up all here, and you could run through every contract test you have every time you have a PR, every time you make a change to your API. And that way, you would always know.
You made it fail if nobody used, is there a way to detect that no one's using that anymore? Make it fail.
Not that I'm aware of. That would be no, not that I'm aware of. I mean,
I think that'd be cooler.
yeah, I don't know. You could do something. I'm sure there's. I mean, these files are all just JSON, so I guess you could write a parser to parse through all the JSON and just like get a list of all the endpoints that are being hit, and then compare that to your rake routes or something like that, and that could be some way to do it.
So I've seen a lot of talk about moving from controller tests more directly to routes tests, where you're actually doing something like this, but on your provider side. Do you see this as like a replacement for sort of those high-level API tests, or is it kind of more about the communication between them?
I think, at least for me, I don't know. Let me preface with I don't know, and then I'll go with my gut instinct would be that contract tests are more about that two-system communication. So kind of my inspiration for looking into into contract testing in general, is we have a pricing microservice here at MakeTime, and we wrote a gem to interact with it. And whenever we would develop and like add or change something, it was like change the pricing service, check if you broke anything in the gem, change the platform, go back, and just keep going back through that loop. And it was like, man, it would have been really nice to just have something tell me whether I broke something in the gem, whether I could add that field there. So like a contract test would have helped with that.
Yeah, just saying this would be really nice with microservices, but maybe less nice with like, I guess, do you know of any times that it's worked like between companies, or is it like purely an internal situation where you have a bunch of different teams working on different things?
It would be a little like between companies could work. It's just that whole issue of who keeps the client, who makes sure that the client keeps the consumer tests up to date.
Yeah.
Like, can you manage that between two companies? I guess you could. Like, if you really had an agreement, like a literal contract between two companies, and kind of the binding for that contract was that these contract tests always passed, maybe.
I can
That's
see
a
how
lot.
if you like provided some kind of service publicly, and you provided a contract test for that service, at least users of your service could verify that a particular version that they're using works with the contracts that they have for their client. So maybe if you like push out a new version of your service, you could be like, make sure all your contracts pass, and they could use that as like a quick sanity check to see if they can upgrade to the new version, or if they need to change something else.
So in that case, the consumer would be maintaining their own tests and running them as well.
Yeah, which makes sense because like it's their code, it's their dependency, right?
Yeah.
And there's always this, I don't know, there's this mindset of like any code that you add to your own code base, whether it's like you typed it yourself or if you just included a gem, like that's still code that you kind of have to maintain, or at least need to understand. So if you needed to maintain it, you could. And I could see how contract testing would be a way to like just quickly verify that this test that you depend on but don't understand works in some way.
Yeah, that actually would be really nice, because I've definitely had that situation where I'm dealing with like some other service, and it's like, what does this endpoint even return? Like, did last week? Because it doesn't feel like it did.
It's almost like it's reverse, like that wisdom, like don't test it if you don't own it.
Mm.
It's like, I guess what this is sort of saying like, no, things that are released to us as consumers, we need to test things like, then we can know who to yell at, right?
Yeah, it is. That's a good point. It is kind of a weird middle ground, but at least the way that the tests read, in my opinion, like you are testing something you don't own, but you're really testing something that you don't own and ensuring that it keeps working with your stuff.
Yeah, it's really more just validating your own expectations of how this black box works.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And with the added bonus of if they honor that contract test, they can't break it without breaking the test.
Plus,
I guess
you're still
they
kind of
could just break it.
You're still kind of depending on the provider to update their contract tests so that it's an accurate reflection of their service.
No. Consumers, you write all of your contracts in the consumer.
Well, the setup code, right?
Yeah. I mean,
Maybe.
this, I mean, make sure that they're pulling the correct version of the contract, but, and the provider states, I guess, that's really, so the provider states, like, the first time I looked at this framework, I was like, that's weird. That's like a weird bit of, like, stringly type coupling, but, I don't, they do as well as they can with the error messages, I guess. I've seen worse. It seems like a somewhat small price to pay, I guess.